Good morning and welcome. So this is part 4 in our series on the ethics, and we're going to do today an introduction to friendship. So we've looked so far at, first we just did an introduction to the ethics itself in terms of the outline, its structure, in terms of the way Aristotle makes his arguments, and the fact that in many cases he's rather elusive. Right? This is not a typical essay or a typical philosophical treatise in which he explicitly states his premise and then follows in a kind of thesis and then follows through supporting that thesis in a clear and unadulterated way. He very often speaks through other people. He says, people say, the few say, the many say, some have said, some philosopher has said, some poet has once said. And he makes his own voice rather elusive, and it seems to be that his goal is to force us as the reader and as the student he's going to lead us to water, but he's not going to make us drink. To really understand something, you or the reader has to be the one to reach those conclusions, and he seems to want to compel us to reach our own conclusions based on what he said. And that makes it a very challenging, but also a very mysterious and exciting text, because I think some of the most important things that he wants to say, he doesn't actually say explicitly. So we looked at to finish up, we looked at the outline, and we saw a connection between happiness, human nature, virtue, and clearly friendship is somewhere in there. There's a discussion of happiness. Ethics is the science of happiness. It leads into a discussion of virtue. Then there is a series of virtues, and some are more important than the others. Then we arrive at a discussion of pleasure, friendship, pleasure, and then happiness again. And it seems very clear that happiness, that friendship is going to be instrumental in producing a pleasure that is connected with happiness. It would be absurd for, I think, someone to conceive of happiness as not having any type of pleasure. Now, the question is, what type of pleasure is Aristotle concerned with? Because there's pleasures of the mind and the soul, and there's pleasures of the body. Not all pleasures are created equal for Aristotle. So what we're going to do today in this introduction is connect up these issues of happiness and virtue on the one hand and friendship on the other, and try to see how they all fit together here. So his primary account of happiness is in books 8 and 9, and we've already seen from the outline the way in which a discussion of pleasure is sandwiched in, friendship is sandwiched in between a discussion of pleasure. And it seems that obviously our connections with others is a source of great pleasure, and perhaps maybe one of the most important sources. And one question becomes is friendship and what is done in friendship actually synonymous with happiness? We've said that happiness is activity in accord with virtue and reason, or living virtuously. Right? And it would seem perhaps that friends are instrumental in living a virtuous life, and perhaps what we do with them is just quite simply synonymous with living virtuously. Okay, so what we're going to do today is just engage in a look at this concept. The Greek word is Philia, and it's translated as friendship, but we should keep in mind that this word also means love, and that the distinction between love and friendship is not at all a clear one. We'll also see that there are a whole array of types of friendship that Aristotle discusses here, and they seem to be ranging from things like acquaintanceship and partnership and alliance to the connections and intimacy that comes from family relationships, and then to this thing he calls complete friendship, which the very fact that he calls it complete is rather elusive. To come back to this concern of the way he talks about things and the way it can be elusive, Obviously, there's three forms of friendship. There's complete friendship, there's friendship based on pleasure, and there's friendship based on utility. And it turns out that not all these friendships are created equal. It seems to be the case that complete friendship is the highest form of friendship. But there's a problem. Its name itself is rather elusive. Friendships based on utility and pleasure are given their names in light of the specific good that is exchanged when one is engaged in those types of friendships. Whereas complete friendship is not named in the same way, and its title, Complete Friendship, is rather obscure. What is it that complete friends exchange, and what does that friendship actually look like? Aristotle really demands that we infer from what he's given us. So some reviews and reminders. Let's look at this connection between friendship, human nature, and happiness. If ethics is the science of happiness, it seems only natural to us that friendship is instrumental in human happiness and obviously therefore connected to our nature. And the question for us is to understand exactly how Aristotle sees friendship as connected in with our highest good, human happiness. First, friendship and human nature. This is really crucial. Aristotle identifies the human being as the rational animal, the zoon logikon, and also the zoon politikon. We're the speaking and reasoning animal. Now this says something very profound, that not only do we come together for mere survival, or that part of the way in which we come together is through speech, right? Rather than things biology like reproduction. And it's very clear that a substantial portion of the deeds, the actions we engage in with one another that create intimacy are acts of speech and reasoning, particularly reasoning together. Aristotle is going to say in Book 1 that two together can better think and act. And thinking and acting seems to be instrumental in our own happiness. And to know what to do, to know how to act, we have to think it through. And of course, the help of another human being to think through what we should do is going to be beneficial in us achieving our happiness. And therefore, it seems pretty clear that what we do together is not only speak together, that brings us in bonds of intimacy, but also we think and we reason together. Now, we're the political animal. We're the political animal because we have speech and reason, and because speaking and reasoning allows us to live under moral categories rather than simply categories of pleasure and pain, right? And to say we're the political animal is to say we're not merely social. We don't merely live together for basic needs, but we live together to satisfy higher purposes. And happiness is that higher purpose. But then how is happiness conceived of as a higher purpose? To live in a polis is to live in a society that provides for all of the fundamental needs, not just of the body, but of the soul. The body, but of the soul. So therefore, the polis is the thing that is complete because it has within itself the division of labor that provides not only for the body, but for the soul. You could think of culture and civilization, of education, and all those institutions that cultivate the soul and its reason rather than just provide the needs of the body. And therefore, because it provides for the needs of the soul, it's the first community that's able to provide for the needs of the good life, and therefore becomes the context in which the human being can fully develop themselves, right? This is our goal. The polis is the environment or the ecosystem where we can fully develop our potentials as a human being, our potentials of our nature. And it seems only natural that, number one, in a polis, we're bound by a common moral code that's going to put us in a certain intimacy with one another, but that in terms of achieving the fulfillment of our nature, the development of and flourishing of our own abilities, that it seems natural that friends would be instrumental in assisting us in that quest. Now let's just keep in mind, our nature consists of a telos, an ergon, and arete, or excellence. Telos is our goal. It's human happiness. Our characteristic function is the thing we do in order to achieve our happiness. And we saw that the plant has nutrition and growth as its characteristic activities, whereas the animal has nutrition, growth, and sense perception of pleasure and pain, and then the human being has those things, but including reason. So therefore, our characteristic activity in terms of achieving our happiness is rational activity, or simply living rationally. Excellence comes in is when you perform your specific function well, you achieve your goal, or to do it excellently. So let's keep in mind that the word virtue means excellence, right? And there's a profound question for us coming out of book 1. What are the virtues that we should engage in to make us truly happy? The question becomes, is it moral virtue or is it intellectual virtue? And there is a profound discussion within the scholarly literature over whether moral and intellectual virtue must go together in order to achieve happiness, or can you have, you might say, just an evil genius who is intellectually virtuous and morally corrupt? Can they be happy? And let me tell you that thinkers on this problem in Aristotle do not agree. There are definitely some people who think intellectual virtue alone can give you happiness, whereas others believe that the both not only are necessary together, but actually might even go hand in hand. The person who is intellectually virtuous, wouldn't they also come to the conclusion that being good is not just what you should do to get by, but that it's the right thing to do in and of itself, right? And there's no clear answer to that. And if we look at book 10, I think you have to reach your own conclusions about that. But let's be clear, to live virtuously requires help. And it seems like friends, we're already hedging toward an answer here of what the highest form of friendship here. Friends are those who assist us in living virtuously, right? And therefore, what might that relationship actually look like in practice? What are we doing with one another? So let's just be clear. You know, the nature of a knife, the telos is to cut, ergon is cutting, and the arate is the thing that allows it to cut well. And let's just be clear. What makes a knife is not just that we say it's to cut, but it's the thing that actually does the job, right? So Aristotle has a very strict understanding of a full human being. Full human being is not just someone born as a human species, but someone who actually fulfills their potentials is, we might say, fully human. Okay. Human being consists of a body and a soul. A body and a soul. And he says the soul should rule over the body like a master over a slave. And therefore, virtue, if we think of living virtually, has to be virtues of the soul. So at the end of book 1 and into book 2, it makes it very clear that the virtues connected with happiness are virtues of the soul, and moral and intellectual virtues are, by definition, virtues of the soul. Now, a soul, of course, is simply the animating principle of any living being that sets it off from an inanimate object. Anything that's living, therefore, has a soul. Of course, it's where we get the word psychology, which literally is the science of the soul. And obviously, it seems, therefore, friends, what they're going to be connected by is not just by their bodies and their pleasure, its pleasure, but by the soul. So here we've just got this model of birth to fulfillment of our capacities. And let's just reiterate here, it's clear that friends are going to be, seems to be instrumental in achieving, if we're going to connect friendship and happiness is this labor to achieve this goal, it seems that friends would have to be involved in not just passing time and enjoying ourselves, but really assisting us in this work to achieve the goal. In a sense, maybe the best way to think of it is a kind of a teammate. So we have a rational and non-rational part of our soul, and we can look at our soul and already see human intimacy and sociality spelled out in it. And the first thing you should notice is that 2 of the 3 parts of the soul are, you could say, asocial. They're not explicitly social elements, whereas the second one absolutely is. So the three parts of the soul are reason, spirit, and appetite. And reason drives us to rational understanding of the world, curiosity about things. We desire to know because we have reason. And Aristotle says in the Metaphysics that everybody desires to know to some degree or another. Then we have appetite, bodily needs, right? There's nothing explicitly social about these. However, it may turn out that reasoning together may be part of friendship. And appetites, we have basic needs of the body, and if we're not self-sufficient, it means they can only be satisfied through the help of others. So we are forced to be social because we have needs, but it's a very low level of sociability. And of course, reasoning, it might require certain types of social connection, but we can also imagine thinking and reasoning about and understanding things as a pretty solitary activity. Thumos, however, spiritedness, is a desire for recognition. And that means a concern for the opinions of other people. We seek to have our own worth recognized. We seek to be validated, right? So therefore, thumos is the social sentiment, and it is the moral sentiment, because morality and sociality are connected. The group tells us what the rules are, and we're going to have a motivation to want to follow the rules because we want to be honored and recognized. Because, of course, the person who doesn't follow the rules is punished rather than they're recognized in ways we don't want to be. So this raises some important attributes of friendship that we're going to see. For Aristotle, life is a stage, and we're all actors, right? And our friends become our audience, but also participants, co-participants in the action, the drama of life, you might say. We perform actions on the stage, and our friends are an audience, right, that judges us and gives us rewards or punishments based on our behavior. So thumos is going to give us a natural inclination to want to do the right thing in the eyes of other people. We're going to see ourselves. We're going to understand our own identity from the point of view of other people to a great extent. And Aristotle, in terms of being a philosopher of the social, and that the human being is a distinctly social and intimate animal, sees our identity largely in terms of our connectedness with other human beings. You can imagine we have that American disposition. I am who I am, and I'm going to do what's right, and I'm not going to listen to anyone's opinion but my own, and that's that. So obviously, there's a degree to which certain people really achieve that. On the other hand, you can imagine if your wife didn't think highly of you, or your husband, or your parents, and your grandparents, and your children, and all of those people simultaneously had a negative opinion of you. You might start to wonder whether they knew something that you didn't, and that their judgment actually really counted for a lot. And you'd really start to realize the extent to which your vision of yourself and your own self-worth is really mediated from the point of view of the other through this thumos, this concern for other people's opinions. So the three lives, we're focusing on, we could say there's three motivations within the soul: reason, spirit, and appetite. And what those three motivations lead to is three types of lives driven by one of those as the arch motivator of our life. We all have a mixture of the three, but it's like, almost imagine like an EQ system. Like some people are a little more on the rational, some people more on the thumotic. So appetite, and of course they're not independent of one another. They all could work together in all types of interesting ways. But the life you live is dictated by the primary motivation you're driven by. So those driven by bodily appetite seek the life of pleasure. Thumos seek the life of really honors, but Aristotle calls it the life of politics, because for Aristotle, politics is the stage for ambitious people to get adulation and fame from others. And of course, this issue of being seen on the stage of life raises the question of, who do you want to be judged by? If your friends are the ones you judge, the ones who judge you, what kind of friend do you want? right? Do you want as many as friends and many judges as possible, or do you want to have the right and prudent ones? So he's already talked in the Three Lives discussion about the life of politics in the way that politicians, as he understands it, seems to desire as many adulators as possible, flatterers, and that what should matter for the human being living the right kind of life is not the number of people who are judging you, but the ones who are prudent and wise and can give you the best judgment. Because what are they going to do? They're actually going to assist you in your living. If you do the wrong thing, they will let you know so you can do the right thing. And then the life of contemplation, the life of study, of inquiry, based on a desire to know. You'll notice how closely these three lives track the three types of friendship. Complete pleasure, based on pleasure, and utility. So notice that friendship based on pleasure is based on two people who both pursue the life of pleasure. When he discusses politics, he talks about how useful friends are. And therefore we could make an inference that the political life demands friendship of utility because people have money, they have resources, they make alliances, they make contracts with one another, agreements, kind of quid pro quo. And then complete friendship. We've said that complete is not the term is not based on the good exchange, so it leads to a question of what is actually involved. Perhaps, maybe, friends in complete friendship are involved in contemplation, and the question then becomes how would they do that together? Do they reason together in order to obtain or gain an understanding of the world? So what's the relationship between friendship, happiness, and virtue? Well, let's just keep in mind the simple hierarchical model that happiness is the good, it's the highest human good or the human good, and it is the thing for the sake of which we do all else, or for the thing for the sake of which we have all else, right? So then the question becomes what role does friendship play in happiness? And I think our obvious intuitive answer is that it plays a dramatic influence. The question for Aristotle is not how much of an influence, because it's central. The question is, what exact role do friends play in fulfilling our happiness? And does friendship actually become synonymous with happiness itself in light of, if happiness is living virtuously, is friendship an act of living virtuously with other people who actually assist you in your own virtue? So the requirements and conditions of happiness: activity of soul in accord with reason. That's just another way of saying living rationally and living virtuously. And then a complete life. And a complete life involves two things: a duration and necessary goods to get by. So this is really crucial in the sense that a complete life, duration, right? You can't be virtuous one day. You can't live a short life. You have to live a long, virtuous life. And if we think of friends, a true friend would think is someone you live a long life with. Not so much a matter of having friends at every stage of your life, but actually having the same friend for a long period of time. And so true friends seems to be connected with that. Then what do you need as part of your foundation of your life? You need friends. And this is very odd that he calls a friend an external good or equipment. It sounds like just a kind of necessary component. The person is a tool to get what you want. But it may turn out that friendship is more central in the calculus of happiness. Then there's a question of what are the best and most complete virtues, which are superior, the intellectual or moral virtues. We've already raised this question. And of course the answer, which I've not given explicitly, is in Book 10. And how would friends fulfill these virtues? Well, think about the moral virtues. Let's just be clear. Moral virtues are their actions, pardon me. actions which exhibit moral virtue are going to be ones done toward others or with others. And those people who you do things toward or with are going to be friends. Touched on some of these things here. Okay, some introductory remarks by Aristotle on friendship. The city comes to being for the sake of mere life, but it exists, it remains in existence for the sake of the good life. Now this is really crucial, because friends are not going to be just a matter of getting one's basic needs or utility. We've already seen that friendship based on utility cannot be the highest form of friendship, because what we want is not just survival, and utility is connected with just basic needs. We want the good life. We want a level of intimacy that's higher than just mere survival. Okay. So this is interesting what Aristotle says early on. He talks about the basic levels of connection, and we think there are more general and more specific levels of connection. And he starts out with things talking about like the connection between human beings and other human beings, and birds and other birds. And what does it raise the specter of? It raises the specter of we're naturally inclined to be connected and friends with what we like. And I think this is a function of self-love, but maybe more specifically, it's a function, self-love is really a function of understanding. We like what we understand, and since we understand ourselves first and foremost, things like us we're going to understand. So he says, well, I mean, what do we have more connectedness? Other human beings or a bird? The answer is obvious. It's a human being. Then he gets to the level of the citizen. And in fact, while the level of the citizen is not the most serious perhaps connection, and this is debatable depending on how we want to view it, he says some very serious things, because in the polis we all have the capacity, the situation to develop our circumstances. The polis is the ecology where we can develop our abilities, and we're all bound together by a common way of life, which is, since we share it, we know it and understand it, and we see other people living it, and we're connected to them. And he says, it seems too that friendship holds cities together, and that lawgivers are more serious about it than about justice. For like-mindedness seems to resemble friendship, and lawgivers aim at this especially and drive out discord because it especially produces hatred. Right? We talked about at the beginning of the semester that utopia is a circumstance where everyone is friends and no one is enemies. And he seems to make a basic point, and this is more an aspirational observation and a kind of hypothetical or based on the logic of it than an empirical claim about the life of, most societies. It seems that friendship holds together and lawgivers are more serious about it than justice, right? If everyone were brought under the same laws, they would be friends because they would have the same fundamental things in common. Their moral virtues, what they considered moral virtues, would be synonymous because the laws shape their own identity, and if they're all shaped equally by the same laws, they all are like-minded. And the Greek word is homonoia, which literally means like-mindedness. And therefore, he says it resembles friendship. Now, notice when he says resemble, it's like friendship, but it may not be friendship itself. I don't think anyone would consider simply being a fellow citizen as a full condition for the most intimate forms of friendship. He says, but when people are friends, they have no need of justice. But when they are just, they do need friendship in addition. And in the realm of the just things, the most just seems to be what involves in friendship. Yet friendship is not only necessary, but also noble, for we praise those who love their friends. An abundance of friends is held to be a noble thing. Further, people suppose good men and their friends to be one and the same. He says, when people are friends, they have no need of justice. And this is perhaps why he says the lawgiver. He's talking about the politician, the legislator who makes the laws. Why is it that they would be concerned with friendship? Because if you can get people to truly bind together, The implication seems to be that they're able to adjudicate their own conflicts without having to turn to a third-party justice system, right? If we are truly friends, he seems to say that in a situation where there's a genuine conflict, we are going to work it out on ourselves freely rather than resort to the compulsion that justice is going to bring with it, right? You need only think of a divorce, which can be done freely with a partner, or it can be done under compulsion by the judge. So we can imagine like a circumstance in which the two people sit down and say, we're splitting up, we have nothing, we need to part ways, but I have had such a connection with you, and maybe we have a child, and we've spent 15 years, 20 years together. I'm going to respect those bonds, and we're going to work things out voluntarily, freely, rather than resort to the judge, right? In which the moment you bring the judge in and the lawyers in is the moment in which people compel each other, say, I want this, I want that, and I'm not going to concede, but I'm going to push it through to the last degree until a third party decides for us, right? And justice means the third party, rather than ourselves, adjudicates and addresses our own conflict. It says, yet friendship is not only necessary, but also noble. This is really crucial. In the politics, we've seen the basis of sociality, the very raw basis, not the total reality of it, or the full scope of it, is based in need and the lack of self-sufficiency. We need other people to get by. But that's a friendship very clearly of utility. He's saying friends are not only necessary, that means we have needs that we can't meet under our own powers, and we need others to help us out. It's also noble, which is therefore the higher forms of friendship are involved in things other than just satisfying basic needs. And the realm of necessity is the realm of in a kind of enslavement, something that's necessary, something that you don't have a choice about. Whereas a friendship that is noble seems to have to do with a realm of freedom in which we choose to be friends, and that we're friends precisely because of those things higher than mere survival, but those things connected with the good life, those things connected with the human soul. And lastly, this is interesting, he throws this in because it doesn't seem to be totally on point with the rest of this paragraph. Furthermore, people suppose good men and their friends to be one and the same, which is to say, I naturally conclude that the people I'm friends with are also good. And is that true? The answer is no, not perfectly, or maybe not at all. But why do we call them good? I think because we see it as a reflection of ourselves. Who would be foolish enough to say, oh, my friends are all so terrible? Because if they realized that, they would realize that they're indicting themselves. If you are the company you keep. If you keep terrible friends, what kind of person does that make you? And this comes back to another point, that coming back to the polis and everyone being friends because they live under the same moral code, one of the most profound things that is going to connect people is a common moral code connected with how you live, because how you define right and wrong determines how you're going to live. It is simply the case that we are just not profound friends with people who live fundamentally differently in terms of their moral codes. We might not be, condemning them for their way of life, but at the same time, it's hard to see how we're going to be connected to them. And for many reasons, we're going to see them as other. There may even be enemies. And it seems almost impossible to conceive of establishing fundamental trust and openness necessary for friendship in a circumstance where people have such different moral codes that they could do something, because of their code, they could be doing something to me that I see as fundamentally wrong. So the only way I'm going to avoid that is simply not to be around them, not to be their friend. Other important introductory remarks. He says, without friends, no one would choose to live even if he possessed all other goods. So this clearly establishes again that this notion of friendship extends beyond what is for the sake of utility and what is necessary. Because this statement implies possessing all other goods, it's as if we have all the goods for our own survival and we could live on our own without the help of anyone else. Even if we didn't need the help of anyone else, we would still want friends, because what comes from friendship is a certain type of intimacy that's not simply about the needs of getting by. It's a higher form of existence. Friends are two bodies in one soul. What really connects us as human beings is not commonalities of our physical appearance or our body, but commonalities of our character, our soul, and our soul is shaped by the moral code and the priorities, the order of rank of values in our life helps shape our soul. And what is he really saying? That friends are really, they're two distinct beings, but they're really one, because they share in a common ethos, a common character, a common cognitive, mental, emotional outlook that they really see from the same point of view. And obviously this connects back in with the theme of self-love, in the way in which we love things that are like us, and we love things that are like us in part because of our ability to understand them. Rodney King, can't we all just get along? So we've seen in Hobbes a whole variety of reasons and motivations and circumstantial issues as to why human beings struggle to get along harmoniously. But we might say, why can't everybody be friends? Let's rephrase it. Why can't everybody be friends? And the answer is because we don't want to be friends with everyone. Everybody cannot be our BFF. Everybody cannot win the Super Bowl because, by definition, being a good friend or a true friend is a special status of high worth or high esteem that you're granting to another person. And to grant it to everybody makes it, by definition, meaningless. It is special, in part by definition, the fact that it's scarce, right? So the person who sleeps with everyone cannot claim the same value of that of physical intimacy as the person who is with one person and is exclusive, and is therefore granting a special status to one person. To grant a special status to everyone is to make the status no longer special, right? Polemarchus, justice is helping friends and harming enemies, right? And if we think from the point of view of the city and citizens being friends, well, then it's clear that that's true, because our friends, from the point of view of the city, are the ones who share a common way of life, and our enemies are those people from a different city who share a different way of life. And that puts us intrinsically in conflict with one another. On the other hand, it's very clear that there's a problem with this definition that we've already seen, which is that on what criteria do we establish friends and enemies? This is a reasonable statement if and only if our friends are people who are decent people, and therefore our enemies, quote unquote, because that might be a strong word here, are people who are not good, to put it in the most simple terms. Edna Buchanan, great statement. Friends are the family we choose for ourselves. Aristotle goes to great lengths early in Book 8 to talk to the extent to which family is one of the most intense forms of intimacy and friendship and love. Why is that? Because we're biologically related to one another. We already have a lot in common. But then we spend, as family members, a substantial amount of time in our lives at the breakfast table, at the dinner table, in the bedroom, in the living room, and so on. We're not just the same genetically, but we grow to become the same, living in the same household under the same rules. So this is a tremendous... Aristotle's very keen to acknowledge and respect the intimacy of the family, but I think ultimately it may not be the highest form, because the family is still rooted in biology. It's I love you because you're like me, because you're genetically the same. There's another problem with family, is that you don't choose your family. you are thrown into a world with a family, and you may have a lot of things in common, like having lived together, having the same DNA, and so on and so forth. But friends are not about bodies, they're about souls. And there's no guarantee that living in the same family is going to give you the same type of soul as your brother or sister. And very often there's that person or persons in a family who just seem as if they weren't raised in the same family. Or maybe you feel that way, right? And therefore, friends are the family we choose for ourselves. Family connotes that serious intimacy. But that a friend is someone who's like a family member who you choose to have based on the criteria of soul rather than being thrown into the same circumstance together. We will skip over these for now and look at Book 8. So Aristotle opens up with an odd introduction to Book 8. He said, it would follow after these matters. And your first reaction is, what matters? Well, if you look prior to Book 8, he's been talking about the two types of virtue in detail, moral and intellectual, right? So we start out with happiness, and we say, oh, it's activity in accord with virtue. And then the question becomes, oh, well, what is virtue? Then we get fleshed out what virtue is. And then he seems to see the next logical discussion is a discussion of friendship. He said, it would follow after these matters to go through what concerns friendship. For friendship is a certain virtue or is accompanied by virtue, and further, it is most necessary with a view to life. It says, without friends, no one would choose to live even if he possessed all other goods. A remark we just talked about, that friends are not merely for the needs of survival, but they help satisfy, and maybe our interactions with them consist of the good life. Maybe that is the good life, being with friends in a certain way. So a strange distinction here. On the one hand, friendship seems to be a certain virtue, or it's a thing accompanied by virtue. Let's be clear, if it's a thing accompanied by virtue, then friendship is a type of relationship. And we will look in a moment here in Book 4, Chapter 6, he talks about the virtue of friendliness, and he's clearly alluding back to the discussion of that virtue. Let's be clear. There is a virtue called friendliness, which we'll look at in just a moment. And then there is a thing, Philia, which is actually a relationship between people. In Books 8 and 9, what he's really talking about is not a virtue, but a relationship that turns out to be accompanied by virtue or certain types of virtues. But first, let's look at specifically what he has to say about this virtue of friendliness, and we'll start to see how it contributes or gives us a view of this relationship called friendship. He says, in our associations with one another, both in living together and in sharing in speeches and actions, some people are held to be obsequious, those who praise everyone with a view to pleasing them, and oppose nothing, but rather suppose they ought not to cause pain to anyone they meet. At the opposite extreme to them are those people who oppose everything and give no thought whatever to causing others pain. People who are called surly and quarrelsome. It is not unclear, then, that the characteristics spoken of are blameworthy, and that the middle term, with respect to these, in accord with which a person will approve of what he ought, and in the way he ought, and similarly also disapprove, is praiseworthy. Okay. Poor us, trying to understand Aristotle here. Let's be clear. In our associations, what do we do with human beings? We live together, and in living together, we share in speech and action. Right? So living together doesn't just imply dealing with mere needs, but in speaking and acting together. And acting together has to do with actions that are virtuous deeds. And by definition, any deed that is virtuous is something that is voluntarily chosen. You see that in books 2 and 3, and goes beyond providing for the needs of life. So going to farm cannot be a virtue of the soul in the way he understands it. So the highest bonds of intimacy for human beings are acting and speaking together and with one another. He talks about two extremes. One of obsequiousness, which is a form of flattery, like you always say the nice thing. The virtue of friendliness is kind of like the virtue of amiability. He talks about people who are too nice, and then he talks about the other extreme of people who are too quarrelsome. Virtues, in books 2 and 3, we discover are all achieved by the mean of action, by which we mean the middle between two extremes. So courage is, on one hand, it's not a timidity, but nor is it reckless boldness. Courage as a virtue stands somewhere between timidity and recklessness. It's like the Goldilocks principle. Virtues are always the Goldilocks. They're just enough, but not too much of one or the other. So he's saying that true friendliness as a virtue is a balance between being amiable and nice, and on the other hand, being willing to disagree with your friend. And we can see how all our friendships are juggling, on one hand, moments where it makes more sense to be amiable, and on the other sense, when one has to stand up and tell the truth and not simply flatter the other person, because you're not going to be doing them any favors by simply telling them they look good. But of course, so what is he getting at here? It seems very simple. And it relates to the issue of pain, right? In friendships, we don't want to cause pain to our friends. On the other hand, being overly or excessively amiable in the long term is actually not going to benefit them. One thing that's painful, it turns out, is the truth. You ask this question, your friend comes up to you, "Oh, how do I look in this dress?" And you go, "Oh, honey, you look spectacular." Right? So there might be a moment where amiability is actually the appropriate response because you don't want to hurt their feelings. But there might be another situation where, in their greater interest, you're actually compelled to say the truth, which is going to be hurtful, yet because in the bigger picture it's going to benefit them. And what he seems to be getting at is that the true friend, if we're just being critical and giving the brutal truth, we're being cruel to the other person, and that's not like friendship at all. The harm in terms of the pain we do to them of telling them the truth has to benefit them in the bigger picture for it to be a real good. So let's just discuss this term, because there's some interesting problems of it, and you see the array of relationships he uses to describe with this term. The Greek word is Philia, and it's where we get our city, Philadelphia. Philadelphia literally means the city of brotherly love. This term is a rather ambiguous term because Aristotle applies it to numerous relationships. And these relationships seem to span from mere acquaintanceship to serious lifelong friendship of the highest order. This is really crucial in his understanding of this concept. Philia is not a feeling. When we say love, it's not a feeling or a passion. Rather, it's a relationship that exhibits a certain type of love to the other person. And still, love does not mean a feeling about the other person. It means how we act toward them and how we live with them. Just like happiness is defined in terms of how we act and live as a human being rather than a feeling, friendship and love is defined by how we actually comport ourselves in this relationship. And this is a clear comparison with the Greek concept of eros, which is going to be the centerpiece of Plato's Symposium, which we'll read later on after the midterm. In the whole symposium is a meditation on what is eros. And the Greek word eros also means love, but it means something specifically different. It means a passionate feeling or desire for something. a desire for something, and it's explicitly defined as a passion or a feeling or an emotion or a desire, whereas philia is a type of relationship. And in chapter 2, he's very clear. He says that philia is not a relationship engaged with inanimate objects. I can't exhibit this type of love toward, he talks about, you can't love the wine. And he says because philia is by definition something reciprocal. Something reciprocal. And that's really crucial because relationships of friendship are going to be involved in exchange. You give me this, I give you that, a back and forth. And the inanimate object cannot engage in that form of exchange. You can love the wine, but since the wine can't love you, it's not philia that you're experiencing. So let's just look. If we want to get a feel of philia, just look at the examples. He starts out from the broadest and he gets more specific as he goes throughout Book 8. Species of animals are friends. And why? Because they have something in common. They're like one another. So he talks about birds. So with that expression, birds of a feather flock together. They flock together because they are birds of a feather. He talks about, a couple pages into Book 8, he talks about lovers of humanity. Lovers of humanity. And the Greek word is philanthropist. Philanthropist. And you see the word philia, the root and the prefix. And it literally means anthropos, like anthropology, human being. Literally as a species. Literally means lover of humanity. And on one hand, it's only natural that we find most satisfaction amongst, at least most of us, there are always exceptions, those misanthropes, those non-lovers of humanity. They love dogs better because dogs never do anything mean to them. Or their cat. But most of us prefer the company of human beings because that is the right register in the cosmic order of things for us to be interacting. On the other hand, can you be a full lover of humanity? No, that's absurd because there's so many different types of human beings and we want ones that are more specifically like us, not just on the level of biology, but on the level of our souls. He talks about the connection between men and women. As a couple, talks about the family, mothers and children, fathers and sons, siblings. He talks about, this is interesting, he talks about the young and the middle-aged and the old in terms of different stages of life have different needs and demands. And this is going to put different needs and demands on relationships. We're going to need different types of relationships. And he has a kind of theory of different stages of life there. He talks about things like business partnerships and alliances, things that are actual kind of contractual or economic relationships. He talks about, this is a crazy question, can masters and slaves be friends? Can kings and subjects be friends? Now he raises these as topics. That doesn't mean he agrees that they can be friends. And actually, to give some insight, he concludes for certain reasons that it's virtually impossible for them to be friends in any meaningful or serious sense of the term. Talks about kinsmen, tribesmen, sailors, and think about why are sailors friends? Because they're stuck in a ship out at sea with the threat of death always lurking, the serious consequences of the ship, and they're in a small space bound together. So they get to know each other really well. They have to rely on one another. Then that creates intense bonds of intimacy. Think of soldiers as well. He talks about citizens. Talks about people who seek the same types of pleasures together and others who seek or hold common virtues. So in Book 8, Chapter 12, in a sense it's jumping ahead, but really in some ways it's the departure point for an example of friendship that is intense. And the question is, why is the family so intense? He talks about the relationship of children and parents. He says the friendship of children for their parents and that of human beings for gods is a friendship with what is good and superior. For they have produced the greatest benefits. They are the causes of the child's being and his rearing and of the education of those born. So this is really interesting parallel between children and their parents and gods and adults which is to say the gods are the parents of the parents of the citizens. The gods give the laws and the rules and shape the moral psychology of individuals in the same way. What do parents do? They don't simply give birth to the child, but they rear and educate the child. They shape that child. And a good parent gives some of, we might not say all, but some of the greatest goods, and therefore there's an intense bonds of intimacy. The child, to some extent, is like clay shaped by the parents' moral codes. There are qualities of the friendship of brothers that are found also in the friendship of comrades. Some comrade seems to be a higher form of intimacy, not necessarily connected with the family. These qualities are present even more among the brothers who are decent and generally alike, insofar as their kinship among them and they begin having affection for one another from birth, and insofar as they share more of the same habits, coming as they do from the same parents and having been reared and educated together. So notice he makes a qualification. Brothers who are alike in decency and virtue are even more friends, and those that have simply been raised together are friends but not of the same order. Now, what makes them so intimate? This is really important. They come from the same parents, 1. 2, they've been reared together for the duration of many, many years, and what makes them alike? They started out as similar, but they became more alike by being raised together, right? And not only were they raised together, they were raised in the same way. Creates tremendous bonds of intimacy, being educated together. And what Aristotle seems to be increasingly concerned with in terms of the source of friendship is our second nature. It comes from our second nature, not our first. And you see the family is a mixture of first and second nature, genes, and also the rearing the parents provide. So now let's conclude this introduction with a look at the fundamental preconditions necessary for human beings even to have relationships or friendships. And they go here from 1 through 7 in a particular order, from the lower necessities, the kind of fundamental foundational cornerstones, to higher things. And as we get to the higher things, they're not necessarily found in every relationship, but the lower things will be more likely or necessarily found. So it starts out with need. What do we see in the politics? That human beings are brought together by need and necessity. Their body has needs that cannot be satisfied under their own powers, so therefore we necessarily turn to others as allies and partners, which you say is a profound connection because it's compelled on us. On the other hand, it's dealing with life's most basic needs, and it's compelled on us. We think full friendship is not just about basic needs, but higher needs. And also it would be something chosen, freely chosen, rather than forced upon us. So we're automatically social because of our lack of self-sufficiency. Then the next one is goodwill. Now, goodwill is a feature of any friendship, and it doesn't mean anything terribly significant in terms of what this is really saying here. Goodwill, when he uses this term, does not mean some great heroic self-sacrifice, altruism for another human being. It simply means a positive disposition that inclines us to trust the other person and to be generally concerned with their well-being. And goodwill even turns out to be fairly self-interested, because if I need something from someone else, it's only natural that I concern myself with the things that they need, because if I do that, I'm more likely to get what I need. So goodwill is a kind of well-wishing for the other person, for that they have the best that they can have, and it establishes a level of trust and a certain minimum degree of loyalty, even necessary to carry on a relationship. If a relationship consists of an exchange of goods, I'm not going to be involved in exchanging my time, my energy, and other types of goods with another person unless I can be sure that I'm going to get something in return. And when I feel the goodwill from the other person, it establishes a level of trust that when I engage in this exchange, this kind of almost a contract, that it's going to be a reciprocal two-way street. Okay, so the next one is an exchange of goods. You think of, if we have needs, then I need to get something from someone else. They're going to give me something, and I'm going to give them something. And the important thing here is an exchange. I give you something, you give me something. Quid pro quo. This for that in Latin. Very simply, if there is no exchange of goods, there is no relationship. And if you think of any relationship you've ever had in these terms, I think this is one of the most brilliant observations on the part of Aristotle, that we're in a relationship with someone because we do need something, whatever it may be, the lower or higher needs of life. And it's those needs being met that allows us or determines that we persist in the relationship to begin with, right? So the goods of our life are simply too precious to simply be handed over to another person without something in return, right? So this also gets into the issue of reciprocity. Exchange must be reciprocal. It must be a two-way street. I am giving the other person something, and they are giving me something. Now, there's some really if that doesn't happen, if it's not a two-way street, the relationship is going to end, because we enter into every relationship, under the premise that we're going to get something in return. And if it turns out we're not getting what we want, and we finally discover that at some point, the relationship is going to end. And Aristotle discusses this, the details of exchange in Book 9, actually, the beginning of Book 9. What kinds of things could be exchanged in a relationship? Well, let's start by looking at the three forms of friendship: complete, pleasure, and utility. Each of them is going to have a distinct object or good of exchange. The second thing is, you discover very quickly that the goods in some cases are physical and material or tangible, and in other cases they're immaterial and they're intangible. I could do a favor for you. I could lend you some money. I could speak to you. I could comfort you. So the range spans the gamut. Utility, the goods seem to be the most material, external goods, and a relationship of utility really could be something like a business relationship where we have a contractual agreement, and we'll see that. Whereas friendship, complete friendship, seems to be exchanging things that are slightly less tangible. The next precondition is equality, and equality is it reveals itself in two ways. The two people could be equals, right? There's a greater likelihood of a relationship persisting and existing between equals. They have the same social status, they have the same intellectual status, they have the same morality. It could be any number of things. However, the equality also deals not just with who they are, but what's exchanged. What I'm giving you and what you're giving me has to be either equal or perceived by the participants to be equal. If I'm doing all this stuff for you and you give me a drop in the bucket and you say, oh, that's the greatest thing, and I say, I just invested all this time and energy and this is not sufficient to what I've given you, well, that's breaks down the equal reciprocity, and that means the relationship is not going to persist. Then the next one is like-mindedness, or homonoia. And it's similar to equality, but it's not the same. Equality implies kind of equal status or equal status of goods exchanged, but things can be equal, but not necessarily be alike. So I give $2 for the cappuccino at Starbucks, and we've engaged in an exchange, and the $2 is equal to the coffee, but they're clearly not alike. Homonoia implies that the people themselves are like-minded. They have similar souls. And they're going to, the greater they have, the more they have in common, the greater connectedness they're going to have. The more they're going to be inclined to spend time and be friends for an extended period of time. Then the last one is concern for the other as an end in themselves. Concern for the other as an end in themselves. So this gets into the question of means and ends. A means is a thing you use to achieve your end or goal, right? In friendship based on utility, we have needs that our friend is being used, you could say, as a tool to satisfy those needs, right? So they're being used as a means. We're not going to be really concerned with them in and of themselves. We're going to be concerned for them simply because they're going to get what we need and what we really want. What the end or the goal is not them. The end or the goal is the thing they're giving us. And this raises an interesting question. Well, is what they're giving us them, or is what they're giving us something distinct or separable from them? So to treat another person as an end is to say the thing you want and your goal is to do something for them, and what you want is them, rather than simply something they're offering you that is separable from them. So lastly is how this exchange works. And we're going to see in these three types of friendship, two forms of exchange, right? So let's be very clear. In exchange, the self, got self and other here, the self gives to the other, and the other gives back to the self. The two forms of exchange, in a sense, there's very little different in how it appears. One person does something for one person, and another person does something back. But what's different is are the expectations and intentions of the exchange. So let's just look at these principles. If there's no exchange, there's no relationship. Goods can be both tangible and intangible. The difference in the type of exchange consists in both what is exchanged and also the intention behind it. In the first form of exchange, when I give to the other person, I do so with the clear, understood expectation that I will get something in return. I am giving precisely because I am expecting something in return. And if I didn't think I was going to get that thing in return, I would never be giving what I'm giving in the first place. When I give the $2 at Starbucks, I'm not doing it out of charity. I'm expecting something in return. And when I don't get my coffee in return, in fact, they've broken the implicit business contract of that situation. In this first form of exchange, let's be very clear. I'm not really concerned with giving. I'm actually concerned with getting. And I give only under the expectation that I'm going to get. It almost sounds like if I could get what I want, I wouldn't give in the first place. So let's look at the second form. In the second form of exchange, I give for the sake of giving without the expectation of getting something in return, right? So my goal in this form of exchange is to give a gift. All right, what's a gift? When I give the Starbucks barista $2, it is not a gift. And the question of why is it not a gift? Because I'm not just handing them $2 for nothing. I'm giving them with an expectation of return. What is a gift? It's giving something to someone else for the sake of giving it to them and benefiting them with no clear expectation of return. Now, nonetheless, is a gift always a gift? I mean, we could probably always imagine a circumstance in which I give a gift this year and I don't think about it, but the next year, all of a sudden, I get a gift back from the other person. And this is really important, this concept of a gift, because it implies I'm doing something for the other person's benefit. And it raises the question of altruism. Do humans do things that in no way benefit themselves? This is a question we'll come back to. If I give a gift to another person, they may not give me anything back, but is there a benefit to me simply in the act of giving, right? And it turns out, just to jump ahead here and conclude this discussion, that complete friendship will involve this second form of giving, where it's less, you might say, selfish or self-interested. And apparently, I am just giving for the sake of the other person. When I give a gift, I am now treating the other person as an end in themselves. In the previous form of exchange, I am only treating the person as a means. They have what I want. I'm going to use them to get what I want, and they're just a node of exchange in the process of the kind of circulation or allocation of goods. Here, we are treating them as the object of concern. What matters in the second form of exchange, in exchange as a gift, is them. So to conclude, let's just look at this visual. I have now separated the reciprocal exchange into two completely distinct interactions where neither of them is explicitly dependent on the other. In the real world, you give a gift, you kind of have some expectation that you might get something back, or you hope to somewhere in the future, but you wouldn't say, I gave you a gift, you owe me something back. You would simply make the calculation that it would be nice if they showed appreciation by giving me something back at the future moment without me asking, right? Because the demand implies that you expected something in return to begin with, right? Like the barista at the coffee shop. So here we've got two separate exchanges. The girl on the left, the self gives to the other, and that's it. And we can raise the specter, is this a totally selfless act here? Does she not expect something? Or maybe in the act itself she's getting some kind of benefit. And then later on it just turns out that the other returns something to us as a gift, and that the two are not, in terms of their intention or motivation, directly related, right? So the concept of a gift. Okay, so in the next lecture we will pick up with the three types of friendship, and with all these tools that we've now kind of gotten in our arsenal, we will apply all these concepts to flesh out these three forms, because Aristotle lays out the structure of these three forms, but he hardly spells out all the implications that these friendships, these three different forms have for what human relationships really look like. Okay, great. Thank you very much.